Thanks, you guys. So great to be here.
So good to have you here, Josh.
So good.
And first and foremost, I just have to say, I am such a huge fan of your hair. It is awesome. Very, it's kind of like David Crowder.
Malcolm Gladwell vibe.
Meets Malcolm Gladwell, meets Keith Green. Anybody? Meets also Michael Jackson in his early Jackson 5 days. Very, very great hair.
This last week, somebody compared me to Jeff Goldblum, which
yes.
yours are much more
Jeff
flattering.
Goldblum, the dinosaurs are coming.
Chaos Theory.
Chaos Theory, yes. Very important contribution.
Or Bob Ross, for those of you who know, that was embarrassing.
Oh, so good. So great to have you here. And just so all of you guys know, obviously this week for the teaching portion is a little more laid back than usual. What's about to happen is Evan and I are basically just going to have a conversation with Josh. And our goal is to get Josh to do most of the talking, which could be a challenge for Evan and I.
Maybe more you.
I have been known to be a bit of a chatty Cathy, but you can be quite the talkative Tina, Mr. Evan. So we're going to try to get Josh to do most of the talking. And,
by the way, he's a pastor at Imago Dei across the river. I didn't say this in the intro. He's a pastor of global outreach and mission. So he's here local doing the nitty-gritty ministry work on the street here in the church in Portland, the city, with all of us. So
yes.
A little more context.
Good. Yes, a little more context. Helpful. Pastor in our very own city and author. So we're going to have a conversation with Josh. Feel free to eavesdrop for the next 40 minutes. Let's just pretend that this giant room is a big living room. And we're all family here as the church, and so you can feel free to just observe, listen in as we have this conversation with Josh. And Josh, let's get you talking. So as we come to this topic, why don't you start by just giving us some of your personal background when it comes to the subject of the world religions, you know. Let's just talk, with you. What's your relationship to religion in general, and why does this conversation matter to you?
Definitely, yeah. So I was an international studies major back in college and had the opportunity to kind of travel and work internationally overseas with working alongside a number of folks who were Buddhist, who were Muslim, indigenous people, and found myself learning tremendously from them. And I would go so far as to say, I found God shaping me and showing up and transforming my life through many of these friendships and relationships with people. And so that was kind of early on going, man, so God, how does your gospel, how does your reality relate to kind of the world religions, different traditions, faiths of the world? One experience I had that was pretty formative for me, actually. One summer I worked on the border of Thailand and Myanmar. And I was working with a small, kind of a local Thai organization. They were combating the trafficking of children in their communities into the sex trade. And some of the Thai leaders that I worked alongside with there, they were just so courageous and sacrificial, and their love and their boldness and all those things were just so tremendous and profound. And there was a small local church. I can only find one in this village. And so I went to church there on Sunday, and I remember at one point the Thai pastor was saying, he was like, Josh, why are you out there working with the Buddhists? You should be here helping me build the church. It's, the trafficking, it's a tragedy in our community, but it's more important that we focus on saving souls so they can go to heaven on Judgment Day. And it's kind of a little bit newer to the faith and all. I found myself really struggling with that, kind of this tension of going, is it really, are all of my Buddhist friends kind of hoes because of the time and place that they were born, is God's end of the day kind of deal is which box would you check on the which religion are you questionnaire? And ultimately, too, kind of going, man, is saving, is trying to stop men from raping kids secondary to saving souls? And I think the biggest one for me was going, man, is the destiny, there's 6-7 billion people in the world, is their destiny riding on my shoulders? Because that actually feels like a weight that's way too massive to bear. Jesus, am I supposed to be the savior of the world, or are you actually, And so that was some of the tension I felt early on. And I remember, at the time feeling this tension of going, on the one side, I'm not comfortable with the sort of all roads lead to God kind of idea because, Jesus, man, I've encountered him, and he's king of the earth, and his kingdom lays claim to the fullness of life. And Jesus' kingdom, it confronts junk in my life, it confronts junk in our world, and he demands everything. The call of Christ is to die to ourselves, and I find that beautiful and profound. And so I wasn't comfortable with kind of the all roads lead to God on this swing of things, but I also wasn't comfortable on the other swing with kind of a people who go to church are going to be in and everyone else is out, and that's, that didn't sit well, not only personally, but as I started to dive into Scripture and dive into the gospel, I was like, that's not what's happening in the Bible itself. And so I don't know that I had strong answers early on, but that was some of the tension early on of going like, dude, I love these people and I'm trying to kind of make sense of this, and neither of these two poles or extremes seem legit.
Yeah. Okay. So you had that tension early on, but today you're here. You've been through a few years, so I'm going to kind of press into that tension a little bit. With respect to Christianity and religion, does now, like in hindsight, and now where you're at now, does Christianity teach that people who go to church enter the kingdom while everyone else is kicked out?
So it's interesting. If you look at Jesus' teaching on judgment, when Jesus teaches on God's judgment, one of the chief, primary, central characteristics of it is that it's a surprise, that its outcome is a surprise. And so Jesus says when God shows up, when his kingdom is established, you've got like the prodigals and the prostitutes and the weak and the poor and the sick and the blind and the lame, those who would have been considered outsiders rushing into the center of the feast, the center of the kingdom, the center of the party. And you've got those who are self-righteous and self-made and thought their own clothes were good enough for the party are getting booted and kicked outside. You've got many people who said, Lord, Lord, didn't we do all these amazing things in your name? Like they're kind of the super Christians out doing the big public stuff. And Jesus is like, I never knew you. Get away from me. And then you've got folks who are like, Lord, when did we see you? When did we help you? When did we know you? And Jesus is like, yeah, I've known you all along. Right? So there's this dynamic when Jesus talks about judgment that I see it as being, when God shows up, there's this weeding out. Like God shows up and he weeds out from his people kind of the hypocrisy and the junk and the stuff that's not of him, and he gathers in the multitudes and the masses. The nations come streaming to feast in the New Jerusalem banquet. And so it's a much more dynamic picture, and it's one with Jesus at the center. And one that I find, another thing I find interesting is when Jesus talks about judgment, his primary target, kind of the red target he's got on the back, is not the outsiders, it's the leaders of his own people. Like it's us as a community, right? Like, so he calls the leaders of God's people actors in whitewashed tombs. He's like, dude, you guys are really shiny and fancy on the outside, but on the inside, you're dirty and dead inside. He calls them blind guides, and he says that you're a brood of vipers. That's pretty bold language, right? He confronts their missionary endeavors going, and you travel over land and sea to win a single convert, and when you do, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. So Jesus has kind of this bold language, and it's coming at us. When people say today, like, man, I'm so fed up with like the pedophile priests and the greedy televangelists and the hypocrisy and junk in the church, I'm like, hey man, like Jesus is too. Right? like Jesus is fed up with that stuff too. Yes. I love there's this picture in Revelation where Jesus is walking amongst the churches, and his primary words, they're primarily words of judgment. He's like, man, your love has grown cold, you've filled with idolatry, like love of power and money and lust and all these other things. He's like, unless you repent and turn, I'm going to spit you out of my mouth, you'll be removed from God's presence, I'm going to fight you with the sword. And so all that, like this judgment language, it's primarily not directed at the outsiders, it's targeted at God's community. And I found, like, I used to think that judgment was kind of this doctrine or something that was for scaring outsiders into the church, right? Like a teacher's whistle on the playground. You guys are all being naughty, come in and get inside, right? And going, no, it functions in Scripture a lot more like a broom, right? Not to scare stuff in, but to sweep stuff out. It's actually to, I think, confront us as God's people in the ways that we are not living into the holiness and the righteousness, the goodness, the justice, the love of Christ, to call our stuff out on the carpet before God so that we can more fully kind of embody his love and his presence, his witness as his bride here in the world. And at the end of the day, all coming back to just going, I think the gospel, what it does tell us, it tells us who the judge is.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't necessarily tell us the details and outcome of his judgment for particular people, but it tells us who the judge is, that it's Jesus, and that he's a good judge, right? Like, he's a better judge than I am, a better judge than you are. Our world needs to be set right, like we need his judgment, and he's the right person for the job, right? And I think it also tells us why he judges. Like, his purposes are good. He wants to reconcile creation, set things right, reconcile our world back to God, and to deal with the unrepentant opposition that we have towards God's goodness and his kingdom. And so I think at the end of the day, we get to kind of take confidence. We don't need to know the outcome and all the details. We get to take confidence in Jesus, that it becomes an opportunity for us to trust him, that he's a good judge. He'll do what's right. He'll do what's fair. He'll do what's just. He's bringing God's kingdom, God's love, God's justice to bear on the earth. And I think it actually becomes an opportunity for us to trust him.
Yeah. Amen. I love that idea of thinking of God's judgment as a surprise. He is the judge and we're not, which is a load off. It's awesome. And the idea of judgment being a surprise, it fits so well with the Matthew 25 paradigm of Jesus judging nations. Like the ones who were judged to be right were surprised that they were, and the ones that were judged to be wrong were surprised that they were. There's a paradigm of surprise that kind of permeates that whole judgment passage, which is beautiful. God's judgment being a surprise. So here's a question. If God's judgment is a surprise, if that's true, then how do you prepare for it?
Yeah.
Like,
good question.
Like us, how do we prepare for a surprise?
Great question. And so I think the tendency is to go, well, it's about knowing Jesus, right? Which it is kind of, but it's interesting. If you look in the Gospels, that Jesus' emphasis seems to be less on, it's not so much about that we claim to know Jesus, but it's that Jesus knows us, right? That Jesus claims to know us. And I think that's significant going, how do we prepare now? I think it's, letting Jesus know us, like becoming vulnerable, honest, open, transparent before Christ with all of our stuff, all of our life, like laying it out vulnerably before him. And when we do that, I believe we experience Christ's love, his redemptive power begins to take root and shape and form our lives. Jesus says, a tree will be known by its fruit, right? My disciples will be known by their fruit. And the fruit of Jesus' disciples is love, right? So if you were to have, like, let's say an apple tree, right? And you've got this apple tree, and you come out in the spring, and you're getting ready to gather the fruit, and there's all these cherries bursting at the seams off the tree. You'd be like, wait a minute. You're like, I didn't think cherries grew on apple trees. Exactly, right? They don't. It's not a cherry tree. And similarly, I think if you're like, dude, I'm a Jesus tree, right? Like, my roots are in Jesus. And then you come in, and it's like, but I'm filled with, like, pride and lust and rage and greed and all these things that God's kingdom stands against. Then like, that's not really a Jesus tree. Right? So Jesus says, like, to press our roots into Christ. When we do that, when we press our roots into him, if our roots are in Jesus, then our fruit will be love. And I love, there's this passage in John where John says, he puts it this way, 1 John 4. It says, God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we will have confidence on the day of judgment. Yeah. Did you catch it? So that we'll have confidence on the day of judgment. This is how we have confidence on the day of judgment today, is by pressing into, living into the love of God and letting that take root and shape, form our lives. It says, everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. And so we can press into that today, I think, by laying the fullness of our lives open before Christ, being honest with him of who we are and where we're at, and letting him know us and his love, his redemption, take root in us and begin to shape and form us as his people for his kingdom, even now, today.
That's so good, so helpful. And I, like Evan, really resonate with what you say and what you talk about in your book, too, about judgment, the idea of judgment being a surprise, because that's so, as you read through the scriptures and the New Testament, that's so true, that theme keeps coming up. But even then, like, even if judgment is a surprise, but we can expect, reading the scriptures, that the Creator God is coming, that every human being will stand before him and give an answer for their lives, and so we will all face judgment. Even then, people can be led to immediately think that, well, then isn't it, when you look out at the various religions or religion in general, isn't it like the best people that will make it into the kingdom of heaven, like the really good ones, the most, when we look out at the landscape of the world religions, is it the most compassionate Buddhist, the most devout Muslim, the most ascetic Hindu, are those the ones who will make it into God's kingdom?
Yeah, Great question. Yeah, because I think on the one side, there may be a time where the tendency was to dehumanize people of other religions, and that's wrong, right? Like they're made in the image of God. They bear dignity in God's image as people who He loves. And we should be able to celebrate when there's good things in life and truth and other people's lives and tradition and culture and all. So that's bad. But what I found today to be the more popular kind of swing of the pendulum is what you're saying, where it's kind of all roads lead to God, and the further you are down whatever religious path you're on, the better chance you have of being in the kingdom, the closer you are to God. And I think the gospel confronts that because we find that it's often the most religious folks who have the most trouble with Jesus when He shows up, right? Like it's often the most religious folks that have the most opposition to God's kingdom. There can be a sense that the further you go down a path where God isn't ultimate, the more that kind of can shape and form you in resistance to God and His kingdom when He arrives. One example that I find really powerful is in Jesus' famous parable of the prodigal son. This is probably His most famous parable, right? And we tend to focus on it being a parable about the younger brother, which is a really important part of the story. You've got the outlaw, right? The outlaw brother who kind of, Dad, give me my inheritance, give me the money, gives him the finger, and kind of runs off to a distant land. And out there he squanders it on himself, and he spends it on whatever. He squanders it on himself, and his life unravels to destruction. And he ends up coming back, and Father, I'm so sorry, and he's repentant, and the father's just waiting, right? He's just waiting for his son. He goes running out to embrace him, and let's throw a celebration and kill the fattened calf. Let's have the big monster party because my son is home. And that's all great and true. We tend to stop there, and I think the actual point of Jesus for the parable, though, is what happens next, which is about the older brother, the religious son, right? A couple of reasons I think that. Jesus ends with that's kind of the confrontation is with the religious son. And in the prior parables, it's all about God, the God who goes after the one sheep and leaves the 99, the God who goes after the lost coin, the God who goes after the lost son. And he's critiquing the Pharisees and confronting the religious leaders of his day. And he lands the string of parables on this older son who, the religious son, he refuses the party for his brother, right? He refuses the kingdom celebration of the Father, the lights and laughter of the festival going on, and he would rather be outside in the backyard, in the darkness, weeping and gnashing his teeth, clinging to his pride, lamenting all the attention his brother's getting, and he's kind of left, he's kind of a slave to his religion, right? He's enslaved by his thing. And so I find there's this really interesting interaction where the parable ends where the father comes out and he's trying to convince the religious son to come inside. Like, come in and join the festival, join the party, join the celebration. And the son refuses. And I think Jesus gives us in this two ways that religion can destroy our soul. Two ways that religion can destroy our soul. First way is I think it can destroy the way that we look at God. Right? It can distort our perception or understanding of God. When he's in the backyard, the religious son says to his father, look, Dad, like all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Where's my party? He's getting all the attention, right? He looks to his father as a slave master, as a mean boss, rather than a good dad who loves him and has his best interest at heart. Right? Like he defines his relationship to his father by his work and what he's done and how he's been kind of like the upstanding citizen, the polished kid in the community. Like he's running for election next year, like he's done his duty, his diligence to care for his community. He sees his relationship to God as grounded in that. And the father comes back to him and confronts us. He says, my son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. He calls him back to the relationship, right? The father looks at the religious son, and the father identifies him by their relationship, by their presence together. It's not by your works, it's by my grace, right? It's our relationship together. And he's like, dude, everything I have is yours. Throw the party. Like, it's all yours anyway. Like, let's throw, like, everything I have is yours. It's grace, right? And so I think there's this point here where religion can distort the way that we look at our Heavenly Father, at God. Second one, it can distort the way we look at others, right? he starts to complain about his brother, his outlaw brother, and the religious son. He says, "This son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes," kind of wasted everything. First off, he's like, "This son of yours," right? I remember being a kid, and my mom, it was usually like, "Oh, my boy Joshua, my boy Josh." But when I messed up and did something wrong and Dad came home, it's like, "You will never believe what this son of yours did." It was a way of kind of distancing relationship, right? And with my mom, obviously, she's joking. It was lighthearted and fun. But here, like, he's serious, right? Like, it's not my brother. It's this son of yours. He squandered everything. And not only does he distance himself from his brother, he also elevates himself over his brother, right? Like, I've been slaving and he's squandered. Right? I've been slaving away and he's been squandering away. He pushes his brother down. He points out kind of his bad, destructive behavior in order to lift himself up. Like, look how much better I am than this other guy out here, right? And religion has a way of doing that, right? Like, where we can tend to use our track record, our performance, the things that we've done and accomplished within our tradition to push others down and show ourselves as kind of being upright. We're worthy of attention. We start to define ourselves by our works rather than by God's grace. And the father confronts this. He says, "No, this brother of yours," he's not going to let him get away with distancing. He's like, "He's your brother." He calls him back to relationship. "This brother of yours, he was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." So the father's not looking back at his track record. He's looking forward. Dude, he's alive. He was found, right? And the father's looking at this scenario very differently. And so we do get this picture here where the kind of religious son, his distortion of God is distorted, and his perspective on God and his perspective of others, his brother. And we see in all of this that God's driving heartbeat in this whole deal is reconciliation, right? Like, it's good. He wants both brothers. He's for the party and for this thing taking place, but it's actually the religious son's religion that kind of enslaves him, that binds him, that keeps him kind of throwing his fist at God because of his pride and his unwillingness to receive the glory of the kingdom.
Yeah, that's powerful. I've never heard the parable of the prodigal son unpacked that way. Religion can, what you're saying is religion can pervert your view and your relation to God and your view in relation to your neighbor, which to me leads to another question. That's where religion negatively impacts your relationship to God and others. What about the 12-year-old boy in India who is born and raised Hindu, who loves his neighbor, who does the best with what he has never seen a Bible in his life, no missionaries ever reached him? I'm just thinking of that kid who is doing the loving of the poor, the feeding of the hungry, the visiting of the incarcerated. He's doing that stuff, and he seems not to be the older brother. And maybe this falls under a bigger question. I know it obviously would fall under this question. There's the little one, which is actually a big one a lot of us think of, which is the 12-year-old boy, whatever. And then the bigger question over that is like, how does the gospel confront Hinduism and confront Islam and all the world religions? How is it? How is there an exclusive battle over reality? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's the individual, and then there's like the reality. You know what I mean?
Totally. So on the first question, like the 11-year-old boy, that's where I think, again, like we're told to expect surprise and that we trust Jesus is good. It's his goodness. He's a good, fair, loving, just, righteous judge. And so I think it's actually hope for the world that Jesus is coming to set things right and to establish his kingdom. And that becomes an area where I think we just trust God with doing what's right. But there are, as you mentioned in the second question, there are these points of conflict, kind of a clash where the gospel clashes or confronts with different ideologies in our world. And so if we go back to the prodigal son story, one of the things I think is interesting is that it's actually God's reconciliation with the outlaw son that becomes itself, in a way, a judgment upon the religious son. Right? And so in the book I explore this in more detail, but the idea that I think it's actually God's reconciliation in the gospel that becomes a confrontation with significant aspects of the world religions. It's actually God's goodness, better than we could ask or imagine goodness, that comes in conflict with some of the other things that we might hold to. And so maybe I'll give a few examples here. First off, I believe God's heartbeat in the gospel, the Father, through Christ, in the Spirit, wants to reconcile all things to himself. Right? So in the gospel, God is reconciling heaven and earth, creation, to himself. God is reconciling east and west, the nations, restoring humanity. God is reconciling weak and strong and good folks and bad folks. Like, his goal in the gospel is reconciliation, healing his world and bringing us back together. And I would suggest that picture, God's reconciliation in Christ, clashes and runs into confrontation with some of the major ideologies of our world. So let's take a look at, really quick, maybe an idea from Buddhism, from Hinduism, and from Islam, and see how the gospel kind of runs into conflict with it. If we start with Buddhism, a central idea would be that of nirvana, right? So nirvana is sort of the goal of salvation, or the goal that we're trying to strive to and get to. Here's a quote. This is attributed to Gautama Buddha, describing nirvana, and he is attributed with this, describing it this way. He says, "There is that dimension where there is neither earth, nor water, nor fire, nor wind, neither this world, nor the next world, nor sun, nor moon. And there, I say, there is neither coming, nor going, nor stasis, neither passing away, nor arising, without stance, without foundation, without support. This, just this, is the end of stress."
Wow.
So it's kind of this picture of nirvana where, there's no earth and land and no heavens or sky, there's no dancing, no music, no sun, no moon. And the idea here is kind of that the created, or the material world, right? Like, it is, there's a lot of suffering in our world. Right? And the root of suffering is that we have these desires and we get attached to things in our real world, in the material world. So we get attached to people, we get attached to things, and then when we lose those things or whatever, it creates suffering and induces stress, right? And so the goal at one level is to disattach or detach ourselves from those things, to remove kind of being bound by affection towards those things, and to kind of reorient our attachment towards nirvana, right? Like, where there's nothing, it's kind of removing our attachments to the material world and oriented towards a non-material, sort of anti-creation reality. I think the gospel actually confronts this with a very different picture of kind of the goal of our salvation. The gospel says, actually, the goal of salvation is the reconciliation of heaven and earth.
Yeah.
It's the created order restored, not abandoned. Right? That the end game is not the extinction of our desire, it's the redemption of our desire.
Yeah.
Right? It's not kind of the annihilation of our personhood from the created world, it's actually the fulfillment of our personhood. And we're fulfilled not by kind of being extracted from creation, but by a restored communion within creation. And that's a very different picture of kind of the goal of salvation, or what we're striving towards. Now, it doesn't mean, I do believe fully, that God is for the person who is Buddhist, right? And it doesn't mean that Buddhists can't say things that are true, right? If a Buddhist says 2 + 2 = 4, that's still true. It doesn't suddenly become not true because we just said it, right? And so people are able to still speak truth and say good things, and even within their tradition, like, I have learned a lot from, one of the Buddhist concepts that it's not just our behavior, but there are these underlying desires and attachments that we have that are unhealthy, and that resonates with Jesus, with the Gospels, with his teaching, and that's okay, right? That's good. There's resonance there. But there are some areas where there's a radical distinction or difference, and particularly like this, like an area like, what's the goal of salvation that we're striving towards? And the reconciliation of heaven and earth is different from nirvana, and it shapes and forms us differently as we pursue that goal. Right?
Wow.
So second, let's take a look with Hinduism. With Hinduism, a central doctrine would be that of karma. And karma starts more with kind of cause and effect, right? So if you think of like a boomerang, and if you're going to do good things in the world or evil things in the world, bad things, they're eventually, maybe in this life, maybe in the next, but they're going to work their way back and they're going to hit you, right? They're going to come back for good or for bad. So this is Pandurang Vamankane. He's a Hindu scholar, and he's commenting on the concept of karma here. He says, a good action has its reward, and a bad action leads to retribution. If the bad actions do not yield their consequences in this life, the soul begins another existence, and in the new environment undergoes suffering for its past deeds. So here we have a sense that you're going to throw the boomerang out, and whether in this life or the next, it's going to come back to get you. And this starts to play into like one's social status, right? So that if I do good things, a reward that's held out is that, I could get rewarded in this life, or in the next life, I could come back wealthier, in a better social position, doing better. And simultaneously, if I do bad things, one of the kind of constant punishments that's held out in many Hindu texts is I could come back as a lower caste, as a weaker person, potentially even as an animal, right? And so there's a sense that elevating upward mobility as a reward for good behavior and downward mobility as a punishment for bad behavior. And this starts to, I believe, start to frame how you look at the world, right? That those who are wealthier, who are doing better, who have better position in life, start to become seen as closer to divinity, right? And those who are weaker or are poor or are outcast can be seen as paying off karmic debt from before. Right? Now, the gospel, I think, confronts this and comes at it at a very different angle, right? Where God is all about the reconciliation of weak and strong. And the way that God goes about that is that he identifies with the weak, that God is close with the poor, the outcast, the marginalized, right? That Jesus says that the way that you treat them is how you treat me, because my presence is identified in many ways with them. Right? And God actually breaks into his world from the bottom up rather than the top down. And this becomes radically reorienting, and that God, the basis is not you get what you deserve. The basis is grace, right? Jesus' question isn't, hey, are you good enough to get into my kingdom? Did you accumulate enough karmic good stuff to get in? His question is, will you let me heal you? And that applies to all. And so receiving grace, like, it kind of removes karma as the foundation for, what's driving your spiritual life. The weakness of God, God's revelation of himself in and through weakness in the world and in our lives becomes something that really confronts, I think, the idea of karma. So once again, I think God is for people who are Hindu, but you can start to see how going further and further down a particular this religious road can start to shape and form you in ways that could be opposed to aspects of God's kingdom when he shows up. Just got one final one with Islam. So obviously Christianity and Islam both teach together that God's desire is to gather the nations, right? To kind of reconcile the nations under his reign. But the way that each goes about that is very different. In the gospel, God is doing that in and through Christ, his sacrificial love, his redemptive death. And what many scholars would point to as a primary distinction between Islam and Christianity would be this notion of suffering versus success. Right? Suffering versus success. So let me give you an example. Jesus, the climax of his ministry, he comes into Jerusalem, into the capital, on a donkey, going willingly to his rejection and death. Muhammad, at the climax of his ministry, he's entering Mecca, triumphant, on a horse with sword in hand, on his way to victory. Right? These are two very different pictures. And within mainstream Islam, there's actually they have a lot of trouble with the picture of Jesus actually suffering and dying on the cross, because that would say that he was not truly a prophet, like God had abandoned him, God had not vindicated. He couldn't die such a shameful death and have truly been from God. And so mainstream Islam will hold Jesus in high respect, but say it's actually a myth. He didn't actually die, he was removed, or they thought he was dead, but he wasn't, something to avoid the shame and scandal of his death. And so the cross, Christ's death on the cross, is ultimately a problem for mainstream Islam because of the notion of success, right? Whereas in Christianity, it's not the problem, it's the solution, right? Like actually Christ's redemptive suffering, his sacrificial death on the cross, is the solution to the reconciliation of the nations, the gathering of East and West into the kingdom reign of God. One scholar, Kenneth Craig, puts it this way: as Jesus makes no triumphal entry into a capitulating Mecca, Muhammad's more effective, in the eyes of Islam, Muhammad's more effective destiny is further seen as indicating his finality as the seal of the prophets. And so again, there's a sense that this looks more successful, whereas Jesus' suffering is a problem. But in Christianity, we see that the reason Jesus' suffering is so powerful is in part because he is the Word through whom all things were made, right? So Daniel Brown comments on this. He says, the question is whether the character of God is most clearly revealed in Jesus' perfect life, culminating in a redemptive death, or in the Quran's perfect book, giving rise to a perfect life. Is the eternal Word ultimately revealed in flesh or in sounds and letters, on a cross or in a perfect law, in suffering or in success?
Wow.
And so these become two different pictures, right? Kind of in conflict at one level. And I would say, that within all of this, we can say that God is for the person who is Hindu, is Buddhist, is Muslim, or other traditions. And we can expect surprise, that God comes to establish his kingdom, and it's shock and awe, and it's surprise, so we don't need to try and play judge and jury today and try and figure out who's in and who's out. We get to trust that to Jesus. But we do see that there are these points where the gospel clashes with central aspects of the world, religions, and ideologies of our world. And in my perspective, it's the beauty of the gospel and the goodness of God that's actually clashing with aspects that I think it's beautiful that Jesus sacrificially gives his life and suffers redemptively for us. I think it's astounding that God redeems creation rather than tosses it in the cosmic wastebasket. I think it's phenomenal that Christ identifies with the weak and approaches our world through weakness rather than strength. Like, those are things to highlight and to rejoice in about the gospel, and to not need to feel bashful or ashamed of. It's good news.
So good. It really is. And I wish we had time, Josh, for you to address even more of the major world religions. You gave us those 3 examples. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because I know you have them, on how the gospel addresses many other worldviews and other major world religions. But we'll have to instead rely on some of these recommended readings. If you want to read more about that, a couple of the books we recommended really delve deeper into those things. But for sake of time, Josh, let's shift a little bit more into the practical sphere. Talking about people in this room today, many of us here would say that we love Jesus, and there's many people in this room who are tracking with you in this conversation, agreeing that, well, yeah, it's not about a religion or how far down some path of good works you are, but it's about being in right relationship with the Father through Jesus. And to many people in this room, where we get that, and we want to love Jesus and serve him in this culture and show that love to other people around us. But here's the question: how do we, as followers of Jesus in such a highly pluralistic culture like Portland, in an age of tolerance and claims of many paths to God, how do we as followers of Jesus go about actually communicating, and most effectively communicating, the central claims of Jesus that seem to be so dang exclusive?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the first things that I think is really helpful is to recognize that this is about way more than what we would tend to call religion, right? I think the category of religion is way too small, where we can tend to kind of go, okay, is it Christianity, or is it Buddhism, or is it Islam? And I think the gospel kind of blows that up to a much bigger picture and goes, dude, it's Jesus reigns over all of life, right? So, for example, here in Portland today, I think we're, as a culture, we're not very fond of religion, right? Like, it's kind of like religion is, it's passé, or it's whatever. And yet, we still have many aspects of our life, our culture, society. The stuff is still there. It's just we call it by different names, right? So, for example, we still have like social benchmarks for how we show, hey, I'm a good person, I'm legit, right? One would be, I think in Portland, it's like, dude, I eat organic, I ride my bike back and forth to work, I support a humanitarian initiative in Africa, like these are, and those are good things. I'm not saying those are bad things. Like traditional religious works, those are good things. But the point being, they become kind of social benchmarks, right? Like ways that I define my identity or show, hey guys, I'm good enough, I'm okay, right? Like we use those things socially to kind of establish ourselves. I would suggest in America that consumerism is our #1 religion today, right? Wow. Like we don't call it a religion, but it is. Like it's where our primary devotion often lies. Like this, the shopping malls have become our new shrines where we gather in search of that newest product for salvation. right? Like, like we tend to identify ourselves by the music we listen to, the clothes we wear, the things we consume shape our, this is who I am to the world.
Yeah.
The kind of modern priests and everything are, I would say, kind of advertisers and corporations that are trying to mediate transcendence to us through the global market. Like, hey, you can become connected to this worldwide global thing. And so that's we don't call it religion, but it's still there today. And so I think the deeper question is probably moving from a, hey, what religion are you? I think the deeper question and more pertinent question today would be, who or what do you serve? Right? Like, who or what do you serve? I love Bob Dylan has a classic line, you're going to have to serve somebody, right? And it's true. We all serve somebody or something. And so we still, like money, sex, and power, like those are still the big three things that we serve. Like we don't bow down anymore to like Mammon or Aphrodite or Baal, like the traditional little gods that were associated with that, right? And we think, hey, because we got rid of the little stone statues, the religion isn't around anymore. But dude, we still worship what they represented, right? Like we still replace God with money. We still make sex more ultimate than God. We still make power more ultimate than God. We devote ourselves to things other than God in our lives, in our society. And so I think having our grid be less of a just kind of a which religion are you, and maybe it's driven more by a deeper underlying sense of who or what do you serve. And when we do that too, I think we may find that we have more in common with our Muslim neighbor than we do with our consumeristic coworker, right?
Wow.
Like, and so it just kind of starts to reorient and shift the deal. But ultimately, we're trying to press into Jesus as our ultimate devotion and give our lives fully to Him, and have on our grid what are the other kind of competing things competing for our affections and our desires in a world that wants to make something other than God ultimate.
Wow. I love how you just busted open religion as just a host of ideologies that run counter to the paradigm of reality in Christ. Man, I have so many questions like percolating in my brain right now, and we have run out of time effectively. We hung out a couple weeks ago, and we just had like a 2.5 hour lunch one day. And I was just like firing things at him after I read his book. Like I'm such a fan of his mind and his life. But I think to leave with one question, as we enter into a response time, we're going to sing to Jesus. To bring it really, really home, like bullseye home, a lot of us have neighbors and friends and family, even family, coworkers that are directly linked to one of these official world religions and consumerists. I don't know if any of you live near any consumerists, but I don't know. But yeah, there's all of these ideologies are directly connected. I imagine a room of 1,000 people. There are tens of thousands of direct network links represented here. Relationships that are touched by or overarchingly governed by these alternate perceptions of reality. How do we lovingly communicate the love of God and the gospel to them? Maybe there's a final word of encouragement on the street level for us in that way, Josh.
Definitely. Yeah, I'd say being willing to listen first and to ask a lot of questions, to truly want to get to know someone and their faith and what they believe, and not needing to get our word in right away. Like being able to ask questions and listen and want to know someone. I love a friend of mine shares, he used to say, he says he used to see evangelism or sharing your faith as kind of like a chess match, right? You're going in, and so beforehand you go and study up on your tactics and get all your arguments ready and whatever else, and then you sit down to the chess match and it's like, okay, I'm going to beat you, and the goal, it's kind of like a battle and your goal is to win, and dude, that's just a really bad analogy for sharing your faith, right? Evangelism. And he goes, I've come to see actually I think a much better analogy. It's like I'm trying to set someone up on a blind date with somebody that I truly believe is the best thing in the world for them, right? And it just changes the game.
So good.
It's no longer like battle mode, right? Like, I'm going to prove you wrong. I mean, you're like it's like, dude, I actually care about you, and I want to know you, right? And if there's the freedom to get to know, and you're not just looking for chinks in the armor. You can actually celebrate the good stuff in someone else's tradition and their faith. You can look for areas of common ground, too. Like, oh, I really believe this, too, and here's why. You can get to know and share and rejoice in. And also within that, there are going to become points where it's like, oh, well, I don't see things that way. I see it this way. But it's more relational than like you're just trying to win an argument. And ultimately, though, it's like, dude, I want to know you. And I also, like, dude, we believe that Jesus is the king of the universe. He's the best thing around. Like, he is the most fulfilling. We truly believe that he's been best for us, and we think he's the best thing for our world. And so we get the honor and the privilege and joy of pointing people to him. And I think as we do that, within all that, I think we are free to emphasizing the goodness of God and his pursuit of us and how he comes after us. When we talk about Jesus being the way, and I think we often misunderstand that, right? I think we often paint that as if Jesus is the one and only way that you go out into the universe to find God, right? And that's actually backwards. In the gospel, it's Jesus is the unique and decisive way that God has come to us.
Yeah.
Right? It's God's movement towards us. And then we get to emphasize, dude, just God's outrageous love for us, our world, our neighbors, and sharing from our own personal story, like just how that's shown up in our own lives. In my life, I had experimented, there's early years like trying to kind of explore Christianity, and I started like helping lead worship and Bible studies and prayer groups and all this kind of stuff. And I found that like almost the more activity I did, the more empty I felt inside. And I finally got to the point I was just like, God, forget it. If this is who you are, I want nothing to do with you. And there's a long story here, but it landed with Jesus, me feeling encountered and surrounded by the presence of Christ. And what he said to me was, Josh, you've had this whole thing backwards. Like, you thought this was about you coming out to find me. And the whole time I've been the one coming out to find you. Right? And I think that just sort of flips things on its head, right? That it's not that we're going out and try and rope people into going out to find Jesus. We're out to boldly proclaim the God who has come to us in Christ to reconcile our world.